The Crow is an action film about an undead avenger seeking justice for his lost lover. This movie is based on the comics where we follow Eric Draven, played by Bill Skarsgård. He's a troubled young man who meets Shelley Webster, played by FKA Twigs, under some unfortunate circumstances. The two of them fall in love and they go about their life together until the skeletons in Shelley's closet fall out and the two of them are tragically murdered. This was such a tragic experience for Eric that his soul could not rest and he is brought back to life with the ability to regenerate. Having lost the only thing he cares about, he decides to go after the people that took her from him, namely Vincent Rogue, played by Danny Houston. So you read the title of this video. I will talk later all about how this movie compares to the comics and the original movie with Brandon Lee, but for now, let's talk about this movie. Starting off with the good, there's a couple good action scenes. You can actually watch both of them here on YouTube, courtesy of Lionsgate. Those clips are not the entirety of either of those scenes, but yeah, these two scenes were the best this movie had to offer. Otherwise, this movie is unfortunately pretty sloppy. What was marketed to us with a single trailer and 2 clips was a brutal revenge flick, and what we got was a pretty scattered movie. I'm reluctant to even call this a straight up revenge flick, which sounds ridiculous. That should be the one thing synonymous with The Crow. But then there's this whole extra can I save her layer that shifts Eric's motives, and it just makes his whole bloody expedition questionably different. This film has some religious fantasy elements. In addition to Eric having supernatural powers, the villain Rogue has these demonic powers that he uses on people for reasons devoid of clarity. The religious themes were cool, it's just that the nature of them weren't ever explained thoroughly enough. We're just left with a lot of questions about the villain's motives. It is also a love story. Shelley contributes most of the charm in the relationship, while Eric is kind of just there for it. I gotta say that Eric and Shelley's relationship did not feel deep and important enough to justify this being such a terrible tragedy that his soul could not possibly rest. If we're being totally honest, it was just a summer fling. Don't get me wrong, it's still tragic, but when compared to other fictional characters who have lost loved ones, his revival does not feel earned. This movie does give us a short scene that gives them a good reason to admire one another. Beyond that, their romance is mostly carried by Shelley's charisma. Because one of the biggest shortcomings of the movie is that our protagonist, Eric Draven, feels really hollow. Rather than adding depth or personality to Eric Draven to make him a nuanced gothic avenger, they legitimately decided that simply giving him tattoos was good enough. They give him the smallest amount of depth through this troubled opening scene from his childhood that he reflects on once. Apparently, this was the source for all of his trauma. Granted, it's a scene that does tip the hat at the comics. I thought that was pretty cool, but for viewers that have not read them, it just raises questions. Regarding Eric Draven's character design, there's really not much that I can say that hasn't already been talked about at length across the internet. He looks bad. This is supposed to be a contemporary goth design according to the director, but boy did he miss the mark. I think that every studio should have at least one 20-year-old Gen Z kid sitting in with their publicists, just off in the corner somewhere, just so they can occasionally consult them to make sure they're not doing something incredibly cringy beyond their recognition. They could just be like, hey, what do you think of this design? It looks f***ing terrible. Thank you for your scathing honesty. We will workshop it. He is not goth, and the only thing gothic about this movie is some of the music. There are some tracks from some old school goth bands like The Cure in here. Prior to seeing the initial character reveal, I was actually excited to see Bill Skarsgård in this role because I thought he was a good person to fill those shoes. Even after seeing the first photo of him, I didn't abandon all hope because I thought that perhaps he could contribute something through his performance. So, to ease you into this next point, I will simply say that I did not like him here. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of other good actors who have also been put into the wrong roles and given questionable directions, leading to subpar character depictions. But that's not to say that Skarsgård is a bad actor by any means, but I'm just gonna say it. His voice was hilariously bad in this movie. To clarify, I'm not throwing judgment at this particular dialect. I'm not saying that real people who speak with this accent sound bad. I'm saying that specifically Bill Skarsgård trying to emulate this accent sounded absolutely atrocious. I audibly laughed several times because he just sounds like a little kid struggling to sound tough. There were also occasionally scenes and bits of acting that were pretty jarring. Like at one point, Eric visits a woman who smashes a cocktail glass on the ground and collapses, stirring it around on the ground, just going crazy, and I'm just thinking, geez, this is total B-movie territory. And the ending of this movie was incredibly frustrating. In cryptic spoiler-free fashion, I will simply say that the final confrontation and the events that follow raise several questions. So even disregarding the source material and previous iterations of The Crow, this movie as a standalone story does not deliver. If the movie John Wick had a baby with Constantine, but that baby was then raised by the Star Wars prequels, then that baby would grow up to be this version of The Crow. Okay, now let's talk about how insulting this movie is to the comics. I know that some people are upset because of the notion that the first film is Brandon Lee's legacy and that this remake tarnishes his name. Well, moving on. In my opinion, the comics are just as important to talk about when talking about whether or not this movie respects what The Crow is supposed to be. The author James O'Barr has such a deep personal story associated with this comic, and it's equally as mentionable when talking about how this new movie serves its predecessors. I do fully support him for wanting to tell this story to a new audience. Making a new movie allows him to do that, because audiences are more likely to check out a modern version of the film rather than one that feels dated. The people who don't already care about The Crow have little reason to want to check out the first movie. That said, this movie's take on Eric Draven's story does not respect the comics at all. It has a somber tone throughout it with its metrical dialogue and poetry sprinkled throughout it. It's a really beautiful gothic story. There is nothing poetic about this movie. They do clarify at one point that Eric, this guy you are currently looking at, defies stereotypes and actually writes poetry. You will not get to hear any of said poetry in this movie. It was a way for them to say that they nodded at the comics without actually doing so at all. Another big change is that rather than Eric and Shelley being long-term lovers who were engaged and had their lives abruptly taken by strangers, they were reduced to little more than a summer fling, interrupted by crooks that Shelley was already associated with, and she kept a big secret from Eric throughout it. Again, still a very tragic experience for anyone to go through, but it's just hard to justify Shelley being the only thing that Eric lived for when they have by no means built a life together yet. And worst of all, this movie does not deliver on the comic's initial core subject in the end. That said, neither did the 1994 movie. It's about a certain F word that you diehard fans of The Crow should know about. Go read it if you're interested. But this movie fails the comic in that regard. It fails at recreating its revenge thrills because of the reduced amount of avenging and the fact that Eric thinks that he can save Shelley. And it fails the romance between Eric and Shelley by throwing in a secret and taking away their innocence by looping Shelley in with the wrong people. I kind of get the idea to shift the story around to make them edgy young people because modern audiences tend to see romance films a certain way. And this was their way of making it more digestible for that audience because they thought it would make it less sappy and more relatable if they did drugs and lived on the edge. But it doesn't capture the same sentiment of the comics at all, and this is frustrating because I know that people are less likely to give those a chance than they are the Brandon Lee movie. So I hear those voices and understand that people are upset because they see this movie as not another stab at adapting the comics, but a remake of Brandon Lee's movie. But this new version is so very different that it's hard to call it a remake. The only credible argument for calling it a remake is that it does use that one line from the first film. You know, the whole bit of when someone dies, a crow carries their soul to the land of the dead, but sometimes their soul cannot rest. That whole bit was not in the comics, so using it in this movie does directly reference the first one. That's a reasonable thing to be upset about. But otherwise, the two movies feel different enough that it's really a stretch calling this new one a remake. You are allowed to not want to watch a movie for any reason that you have. I just don't personally think that it's immoral to make a new Crow movie. What's unfortunate is that this new one is very bad. So before I give you my overall rating, I kind of just want to go off script, and in typical sentimental fashion of this channel, I want to read you this really beautiful introductory bit from the comics. It's a bit that I thought was really moving, and to me, this is the message behind The Crow, and I don't think that this movie communicated that very well, so I kind of just want to take the liberty of doing that myself. One day, you are going to lose everything you have. Nothing will prepare you for that day, not faith, not religion, nothing. When someone you love dies, you will know emptiness. You will know what it is to be completely and utterly alone. You will never forget and never ever forgive. The lonely do not usually speak as completely and intimately as James O'Barr does here in this book. So if anything, at least take this lesson from The Crow. Think about what you have to lose. So the comic is beautiful and this movie is not. It's not very often that I throw around the terrible rating, but wow, twice in 2 weeks, and both of them for Lionsgate movies. Pair these bombs with the Megalopolis trailer controversy, and yeah, they are really not having a good summer. If you're not a Crow fan and you want something to turn your brain off to while you have a couple drinks, wait for this movie to come to streaming and you might get something out of it. Otherwise, just don't bother. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please give it a like. It really does help the channel grow. I'll see you later this week with my review of Blink Twice.